Welcome everyone. My name is Andrei Yakovlev, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Russia and Eurasia program here at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and we're delighted to welcome three distinguished guests today to discuss economic pressure points, the reach and limits of Western sanctions on Russia. Please note that the event is being recorded, and let's make sure the microphones are on. So this event is in some sense a follow-up conversation to a conference we hosted back in September of 2024 on economic warfare between Russia and the West. And so this panel will assess the effectiveness of sanctions from both economic and legal perspectives. We will explore certain measures and how they have struggled to meet their intended goals, and how that has influenced domestic economic dynamics within Russia. We will also look at the broader implications for global markets, including labor and currency fluctuations. We will explore legal challenges of implementing and enforcing sanctions, and the evolving scope of sanctions compliance efforts. I am pleased to introduce our three distinguished panelists. Oleg Itskhoki is a professor of economics at the Department of Economics at Harvard University. He was previously at the University of California, Los Angeles. He is also a fellow of the Econometric Society, an NBER research associate, a CEPR research affiliate, and an associate editor of the American Economic Review. His research interests are in macroeconomics and international economics, where he studies globalization and labor markets, currencies, exchange rates, international relative prices, and many other topics. Andrei Yakovlev is an economist whose primary research interests include state business relations in Russia, political economy of development, industrial policy, public procurement, and incentives for bureaucracy, with a comparative study of Russia and China. From 2022 to 2023, he served as a visiting scholar at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. And since November of 2023, he has served as a fellow at the HWK in Germany. And finally, Christine Abely is an assistant professor of law at the New England Law in Boston, where she teaches contracts and international business transactions. She is the author of The Russia Sanctions, the Economic Response to Russia's Invasion of Ukraine, published in 2023. She is also a licensed customs broker and has worked in business litigation and international trade and sanctions law. So welcome to all of you, and welcome to the audience. Each of our panelists will speak for about 10 minutes, and then I might ask them a couple of questions before turning it over to all of you for a Q&A session. So Oleg, please.
Thank you very much. Showing a couple of pictures. So Nina Rabakova is my co-author. She was here since September. I'm not sure if she thinks if you have the same thing or not, but I'm gonna just selectively a couple of things from a paper that we recently wrote with her. So it's a paper from, which is I need to send the final version. Sorry, it's really simple. I remember what's in the paper. But I also want to selectively show you a couple of things. I guess people really want to know the answer if sanctions work or not, and they want like a kind of yes or no answer to this. This doesn't quite make sense. Sanctions is sort of like a tool. It's not the magic wand. It's not like you can solve all problems with that. But it's a policy tool, and sort of you want to use it in a way that kind of optimal together with other policy tools that you have at your disposal. Right? And typically, the answer is whether it's working or not. You need to have a pretty clear quantitative causal link in a sense, right? So most arguments that doesn't work at all make no sense. Arguments that it works and it will solve every conflict and equation. That's also so we wanted to kind of take a more quantitative view of this and think about it. The second point is just to understand sort of like the premise of the question here. So this is different countries by size in terms of their economy and their population. And so Russia is quite a large economy. It's among top 10 economies, but at the same time, This is slightly smaller than the state of New York. They're largest state economically in the US. It's about the size of Benelux, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And we don't really think of those as huge countries, but it's economically significant country. But it's 10 times smaller than the European Union, and also 10 times smaller than the US. And if you take into the coalition of Western countries like Japan and South Korea and Australia, Canada, it's sort of like almost 2 orders of magnitude smaller. And you're right, the question is like you cannot solve the conflict with military means because Russia has nuclear weapons, but why can't you solve it with economic means given the size differential, right? So that's clearly, I think, an interesting way to pose the problem. The other thing to know is I put Ukraine down. Ukraine is about 10 times smaller than Russia, right? So Russia is 10 times smaller than the European Union, but Ukraine is 10 times smaller than Russia. And the other thing to keep in mind is Russia is spending about 10% of its GDP on the war in Ukraine right now, about $150 billion. It's a little less than 10%. And in perspective, it's crazy. It's spending a pre-war GDP of Ukraine. Now the GDP of Ukraine has declined considerably during the war. Russia is spending every year close to GDP of Ukraine pre-war to fight this war. And so the question is, how come you can get all this resources? This is economic history of Russia, but I think what's kind of significant is there hasn't been much growth. There was a big economic collapse after the collapse of Soviet Union. In all post-Soviet countries, then there was about a decade of very fast growth, and then about 12 years of economic stagnation. And I'll show you some pictures. So kind of ironically, when all the sanctions happened in 22, the projections were that Russia will actually contract to about 10% of GDP. It contracted only by about 2% of GDP. So they said there's last 2 ticks that you see. But the last 10 years were the years of fastest economic growth in Russia. 12 years, they're close to 4% of GDP. It's a funky growth. I mean, we can talk about it a little more, but nonetheless, this is like quite unusual given the record of the previous 12 years. You can also think about it in comparison, right? These are also the years of super high oil prices in comparison to previous 8 years. And so if you look at other oil exporters on the right chart, they grew about 8% in 22 because of oil prices. And so Russia declined by a couple of percent points. And so in that perspective, you can maybe think of that as the toll of foreign sanctions. But it's also kind of hard to know exactly what's the causal impact. I mean, this thing is very important to keep in mind. Is that when the war started and all the sanctions were imposed, the sanctions were highly imbalanced. I mean, the financial sanctions, which really started in 2014. And, it's interesting to think about 2014 sanctions. They were financial sanctions with a lot of sort of like anticipation of what might come if the war doesn't stop in 2015. The war did stop in 2015. And the way to think about it, like American Treasury views this as a success of sanctions in 2014. Then they implemented this through the escalation of conflict and really bought 8 years of sort of peaceful ceasefire. Well, clearly Putin used those 8 years, and it doesn't look like European Union used those 8 years really well. Ukraine used it quite well. I mean, the army of Ukraine used it well, but the European Union economically didn't really use those 8 years, right? And so that's kind of what we know. But then once 22 happens, there are further financial sanctions, sort of as promised back in 2014, but sort of already pre-announced. So, the Russian economic bloc, they knew what is likely to come. They were surprised by some things, but they were not surprised by some other things. And then there was a combination of sort of what's called export controls, so sanctions on Russian imports, and some embargoes, right? But the timing of it was kind of funky. So you see this orange line right here, and this is when the war starts and their export controls. And so the trade collapses with a lot of countries, including actually with China, surprisingly. Because China never joined the coalition of sanctioning countries, but in the first months, there's a lot of uncertainty whether secondary sanctions will be enforced, imposed, unenforced, and so on. So trade has really collapsed. But there's nothing on the sort of export side. Russia keeps exporting at record high commodity prices at the time, and you can sort of see this gap between the blue line, which is exports, and the orange line, and then this becomes accumulated assets. And you can see here on this graph, this is record breaking 1 year trade surplus, right? And in a way, right, it's kind of like could have tightened consumption quite a lot, but at the same time, it relaxed quite a lot also the budget constraint, right? And so, like, if you ask where those $150 billion revenues are coming from, well, to a large extent, what sanctions were very successful at, like you showed in terms of ideas. This is the picture. So this is the last picture is the million barrels a day of oil that come to world market, and the sanctions were very successful at keeping the quantity of Russian oil flowing without disruption to the world market. Right? That's really what the sanction policy achieved. You see a dramatic substitution that happened. Right? So European countries were the major consumers in blue. And during 2022, essentially, this shifted to China, India, and Turkey, like became major consumers. So what surprised economists is the speed of the substitution. Like maybe nobody imagined that the substitution of the scale can happen in 1 year. Yet both Russia succeeded at the trade and European Union succeeded at the trade. The substitution, so the right panel, the gray dots are the world prices, and you see world prices kind of, well, you don't see actually quite the extent to which they went up just a couple of years before. World oil prices stood zero, if you might remember. During the COVID pandemic, there were days when oil prices were negative. I mean, that's a fluke, but like oil prices were at around $40 a barrel, and then they go up to $120 a barrel. So those are the gray lines, right? 120 something at the peak, and then it stabilizes at 80, 85, which is still very high levels compared to the previous year. But the blue dots is the price that Russia received. And this indeed a big discount. And this discount largely went to finding new customers, in particular in India. So India was the major beneficiary of that, that it received oil with discount. China actually was paying close to market prices. Turkey was receiving a discount. These are the two major new customers for Russian oil. But amazingly, the price cap came in around here, and this is the period when actually discount stopped. So it's kind of funny, like the discounts were large before the price cap, and once price cap came in, I mean, it's not the average, it's like an effect of the cap. Maybe shaves off 10% of revenues over 6 months, but then this discount essentially shrinks quite a lot. Let me show you a couple more things about stock. So I think this is just how thinking about the efficiency of sanctions policy. Sanctions really effective if you go after a small country. Now listen, I mean, it is still effective if you go after a bigger country, but you will have to pay some costs. So from economic theory, that the costs are proportional to the size of the sanctions. And so you can principle there sometimes it comes the other thing is, it's not just the size, but it's also the ability to substitute how big is the sanction violation. And so if you go back 30 years ago, this is the blue curve, it's the share of GDP that was produced in free countries, right, in democratic countries. And that was over 75% of the world. Right? And so this is the, Fukuyama's end of history, that, right? But then over the last 20, 30 years, the picture changed. The West, or the Western liberal democracies, they only produce about 65%, 60% of and we have all sorts of countries that are not sort of rushing to become part of the Western coalition, like South, China is a big part of it, obviously. China is separate from it. You have countries from the South, like Brazil and India, Turkey maybe as well. And so once you can substitute away, it's very easy to substitute away from Western countries to other countries that they're willing to sign. So Robert Groups really likes this feature. So this is the trade of Germany with Kyrgyzstan. And obviously now Kyrgyzstan is a tiny country, so this really is not really representative. It's a very star picture. The star because Kyrgyzstan is very small. In fact, sanctions do have an effect. It's not like a full substitution happens to Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, Turkey and other countries, but we have quite a lot of substitution that's happening. I think I should stop and maybe look. This is another example. This is semiconductor trade. It's not really important exactly the names and numbers here, but the gray lines are the trade between historical. And the first two years that China were the biggest suppliers of semiconductors. And cumulatively, everybody else is quite large as well. Everybody else is mostly the European countries and the US. And then when the war starts, you can see what happens with the grandfathers, right? Like essentially everybody stops selling semiconductors for a while. This is the year of the war, the year. And then China Hong Kong just released these kind of substitutions happen a lot. And so, yeah, I think one thing that's under discussed missing is, this is the age structure and population structure of Russia. And so this is a 25-year-old males. And so the war combined with sanctions and years, right? Really, the just over sanctions. So this is the effect of previous waves of economic crisis in the 90s. During the Second World War, they happen to be exactly in the same part of the population structure. This is by far, this is by far the biggest economic impact persists for many, many years. In particular, it's reflected in that this is the unemployment rate. This is what happens as a result of its recurrent war economy. So the way to think about it is you still have very large export revenues. To a large extent, they're allowed to finance this 10% of GDP of military expenditure. It happens on the finite labor resources, the resources shared on the labor side. You have this huge demand for labor from both the military and non-military sectors, which results in this low unemployment, abnormally low unemployment, and inflation that's impossible to curb because of this labor market. But this situation seems to be fairly stable. Like, it does look like there's any sign of immediate crisis in the Russian economy despite all the sanctions. It's not as though the situation is stable in the medium term. It's more sort of sign that this has to stop in some way for months, year and a half. In a sense, this is this fairly situation of military economy that keeps working despite Russian sanctions, and yet you can discuss maybe. So what was that here?
Excellent. Thank you, Oleg. Andrei, the floor is yours.
Actually, Oleg provided quite clear and broad picture of the topic, and perhaps I will add some kind of specific dimension based on my personal experience in some sense. No, actually, Arik told already that I worked mostly in the field of political economy. But he didn't mention that I spent 30 years at Higher School of Economics in Moscow doing different kind of empirical research. But during this research, I could establish a lot of contacts with people from Russian business. And even after leaving Russia in March of 2022, I can keep some of these contacts. Yeah. And it is quite important source of information for me, some kind of personal perceptions. What can I say based on a series of such kind of in-depth interviews? Actually, I have a paper based on these interviews, and I can share it if it will be of interest. So, initially, just before the war, Russian business had very negative expectations regarding sanctions. And during first weeks and approximately 2 months, it was more or less the same situation with some kind of expectations about maybe not collapse of Russian economy, but huge problems. Already in summer of 2022, it became clear that situation is not so worse. And already in the autumn of 2022, it was possible to see some kind of economic growth in some sectors, some adaptation and so on. Regarding the explanations of such kind of effects, important point is about previous experience of Russian business. Actually, Oleg told about stagnation of the previous decade. But it was not only stagnation, it was a series of crises, starting from a global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and including, of course, COVID pandemic. But in between, it was a series of crises actually created by Russian government with quite serious consequences for Russian business. But as a result, Russian business in general was much more prepared to different kind of unexpected events. They had more reserves. They had less credits in banks and so on. And more generally, they were psychologically prepared to such kind of unexpected bad news. Next point, of course, was related to experience of Russian government, and especially experience of COVID pandemic was quite important, because Russian government could create some quite efficient anti-crisis mechanisms in 2020. Government spent about 2 or 3 months for elaboration of such kind of mechanisms, and they were implemented in 2020 with some delay comparing to similar steps in Europe. But in 2022, they really in 2 or 3 weeks implemented the same mechanisms, mostly with provision of subsidized credits to many firms and so on, but with a much broader scale, because in 2020 it was mostly for small business and mostly in services, and in 2022 it was practically for all economy. But maybe much more important, or at least with the same importance element, is about reaction on sanctions on the side of countries of global south. Because if we will talk about if you will provide some kind of comparison, if we have one room with 2 doors, and one door is fully blocked, but another door is fully open, of course it can be costly, especially at the beginning, to relocate the flows of goods, services, and so on, from first door to second one. But it can be done. And actually, it was done already in 2022. And for instance, for this, my conversations with my respondents, because I had some opportunity to talk with the same people in 2022, in 2023, in 2024. Actually, all next wave of sanctions, starting from actually summer and autumn 2022, didn't provide any serious effect on these firms. Maybe with only one exception of secondary sanctions of this year, because they led to much longer supply from China. For better understanding of some kind of additional costs. It is example from one middle-size manufacturing company, which worked historically with European and American suppliers. And usually they could get necessary supply before the war, from Europe in 2 or 4 weeks, from US maybe 6 weeks or 8 weeks, something like that. They should relocate practically all demand to China. They till now could get some supply from US, but it is in much lower volume, 3 times lower, and it is much more expensive, about 2 times expensive. And we're using some kind of schemes with Turkey and so on. But most supply we get now from China. Before the summer of this year, it was about 4 months. But it means that this company needs some additional working capital, because all processes became longer. Now it is about 6 to 7 months. And it is exactly some kind of consequence of this pressure from US on Chinese banks, on Chinese firms, and so on. It is not full stopping of supply. It works, but it's necessary to find already not regional banks, but some kind of sub-regional banks, and so on and so on. It became more and more costly. But another part of this story is about real increase of anti-Western attitudes. And it's necessary to stress that my counterparts are represented not by old-style directors with some kind of involvement in different kind of corrupt schemes and so on. At High School of Economics, I mostly worked with some kind of advanced teams, having a lot of Western partners and so on. And regarding this anti-Western attitude, they themselves explained it by following arguments. Sanctions really provided some pressure. Maybe not catastrophic, but quite serious. Yeah, it is costly. But, and especially, for instance, if you are talking about top-level businessmen, which were included in personal sanctions. For them, it is really costly. Much more costly comparing to this middle-sized manufacturing firms, for instance. Yeah. But they didn't understand any exit options. What we should do to exit these sanctions. Because again, especially if you are talking about personal sanctions, many of these people would be happy to leave Russia and to exit sanctions. But we simply didn't understand and don't understand how to do it. There are some unique examples like Volk from Yandex, but it is totally non-transparent case. And it is practically only one case for thousands of people. And the point is, no, and actually it already is, it's my point, it's not from my estimates, is that unfortunately, no, maybe due to some kind of expectations for very short effects of sanctions at the initial stage of the war, yeah, on the side, no, not of experts, on the side of the Western politicians, yeah. They prefer to implement all possible sanctions at the same time with some expectations that regime will collapse and the Russian economy will collapse. And after that, it will be already not so important was this combination of sanctions efficient or not. But in reality, we are already in totally another scenario with some kind of long-term consequences of sanctions. And the absence of clear goals and clear strategy behind sanctions. Because, for instance, I had some conversation in September in London with one representative of UK Foreign Office. And I asked him about the goals of sanctions, especially in the case of UK. And he told me that, yes, again, it was his personal opinion, not the position of Foreign Office and so on. Yeah? Because, again, according to some official documents, it's practically not possible to find any formal goals. I'm talking not about qualitative goals, even general goals. Because yes, it was some declarations about limiting financial opportunities for Kremlin to continue the war. In reality, it was totally not so. Because in 2022 especially, the Kremlin had much more money comparing to the 2021. But more generally, from my personal conversations with experts, both in US and also in Europe, unfortunately, there is no any clear understanding or vision what kind of Russia US and Europe would like to have after the war. What kind of Russia can be acceptable? And who should do and what should do, yeah, to change the situation in Russia? Again, my point is that sanctions, exactly as I told already Oleg, it is tool. But if this tool is implemented without clear strategy, it's not enough. And again, for instance, for my counterparts in Russian business, sanctions, of course, is some kind of negative incentive. It's clear. But without any offer to maybe not the best, but at least pragmatic part of Russian elite, which is not happy with war. There is a lot of such people. But without offer to these people, with some kind of clear idea what they should do to stop the war and what they can expect in exchange. Because again, for them personally, it is extremely risky to do anything against Kremlin just now. So maybe I will stop here. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Andrei. And finally, Christine.
Thank you. This evening, I wanted to discuss the secondary sanctions measures and other legal provisions which attempt to increase the effectiveness of the sanctions already in place which were imposed following the invasion of Ukraine. So primary sanctions, as you know, imposed by the sanctioning nations were necessarily somewhat limited in their effectiveness given the large portions of the world that did not join in the sanctions response, including major economies like China and India. The imposition of secondary sanctions, along with increased enforcement of sanctions on those in third-party nations, attempted to affect the willingness of those in third-party nations to deal with sanctioned Russian targets and perhaps to discourage dealings with Russia on the whole. So certain of the primary sanctions measures and the export controls implemented immediately after the invasion extended the reach of the sanctions against Russian targets in ways that perhaps were reached further than the sanctions on the targets themselves. So the foreign direct product rule, for example, prohibits certain foreign produced items from export to Russia when they were produced using US origin software technology. There are prohibitions on facilitation by US nationals, which prohibit those parties from playing even an indirect role in sanctions evasion activities. The power of the US dollar to transmit US sanctions restrictions to non-US parties, along with the fact of the US dollar as the world's dominant currency in cross-border trade, meant that those in third-party nations were now prohibited from transacting with sanctioned Russian parties using the US dollar. Since that time, the Biden administration has chosen to deploy secondary sanctions alongside additional sanctions designations as some of its preferred tools for seeking to increase the effectiveness of sanctions. On December 22, 2023, Executive Order 14144 provided the authority for the designation of foreign financial institutions who had conducted or facilitated any significant transaction in support of Russia's military-industrial base, or for any party sanctioned for having operated in the technology, defense, construction, aerospace, or manufacturing sectors of the Russian economy. On June 12th of this year, OFAC updated the definition of Russia's military-industrial base to include all persons and entities blocked under Executive Order 14024. One effect of this was to prohibit transactions between foreign financial institutions and block Russian financial institutions like VTB and Sberbank. The Bank of China currently seems to be blocking transactions denominated in the Chinese currency to parent exporters to Russia, and other Chinese banks do seem to be blocking some transactions involving Russia generally, demonstrating the effect of secondary sanctions to increase the reach of sanctions beyond just their initial targets. At the end of October, Treasury sanctioned 275 parties in 17 jurisdictions, including India, China, Switzerland, Thailand, and Turkey, including parties in procurement networks and Russian importers and producers. Around the same time, the Bureau of Industry and Security and the U.S. Department of Commerce added a few parties to the entity list for evasion of the export controls, making those parties themselves denied from receiving U.S. exports. And the EU has also moved to strengthen its sanctions, having decided recently to prohibit the export from the EU to Iran of components used in development and production of missiles and drones. The UK's Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation has issued its first ever monetary penalty for a violation of the sanctions against Russia. It was a £15,000 fine against a company for receiving payments from a sanctioned party. Eddie Fishman called last week in a Washington Post op-ed for secondary sanctions to be made possible against purchasers of Russian origin energy supplies and ship sellers. So too did he call for a strengthening of primary sanctions by way of eliminating the general license, which currently authorizes payments for Russian origin oil and natural gas. Going forward, the EU will certainly remain as a proponent and user of strong sanctions against Russia. As Maria Shkina has pointed out, the EU's historical objections to the extraterritorial application of sanctions seem to be waning. And she notes examples such as a restrictive measure, which requires the non-EU subsidiaries of EU companies to make best efforts to ensure compliance with EU sanctions. This is reminiscent of U.S. provisions, which require that foreign subsidiaries of U.S. companies comply with certain of the U.S. sanctions programs, such as those in place with respect to Iran and North Korea. The emergence of the EU as a prominent sanctions power, especially given the depth of its economic relationship with Russia pre-invasion, may indicate that sanctions will have continued effects going forward. Michael Waltz, Trump's incoming former President Trump's incoming national security advisor, co-authored a piece in The Economist calling for the use of economic leverage, including cracking down on Russia's illicit oil sales. The piece, however, noted that, quote, supporting Russia for as long as it takes in a war of attrition against a larger power is a recipe for failure, which suggests that perhaps the administration of President Trump in January may not be as committed to a longer-term sanction strategy in the same way that the administration of President Biden was. One key aspect of the sanctions response has certainly been the coordinated effort between the EU, the US, and the other sanctioning powers to ensure the maximum impact of the sanctions implemented, and where President Trump, if in fact he does see the sanctions regime as something that ought not be continued in the longer term, then the coordinated sanctions effort may be in danger of breaking down over that longer time horizon. The effectiveness of sanctions may in the future depend on the commitment to enforcement, the continued implementation of secondary sanctions, and the preservation of the coordinated effort among the sanctioning jurisdictions.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Christine. To our audience on Zoom, you're welcome to ask questions via the chat, and I will receive them. And to our in-person audience, you're welcome to start thinking about questions now. I will ask a question, and I'd like to turn it over to all of you. My question concerns the missed opportunities that Oleg was referring to in his opening remarks. Of course, we do need to understand the goals and the strategy behind Western sanctions on Russia. And as Andrei said, they have not always been clear or in some cases have evolved over the course of recent years. And we discussed that at the conference 2 months ago. I wonder, though, if in fact the goals were not, changed from coercion to putting maximal economic pressure on Russia, making the war as costly and as difficult for Russia to pursue, if there had been other measures that the West could have pursued much earlier. And I'm thinking about things like encouraging capital flight, brain drain from Russia. Perhaps some of the secondary sanctions could have been introduced earlier. Let's go around and do you have any ideas on what the West missed over the last 3 years when it comes to sanctions? Oleg?
Yeah, no, things here. So I could respond to what Andrei said, very interesting, but in my opinion, it's wishful thinking to believe that we can design the smart sanctions that will help the current people away from Putin because they get like some carrots if they do it. Like in the end of the day, when Putin appears to be strong militarily and economically, people around him better. If he appears weak militarily and economically, people will start turning away from him. The goal of sanctions, there is a military component. The goal of economic sanctions is to create a regime of maximum pressure, right? And Putin's regime look economically weak. That has not happened yet. What was the goal? Well, impose maximum pressure, provided that it's not too economically and politically costly. Not too economically costly and politically feasible for the country. Right? And this constraint was very, very binding. It was economically costly and politically feasible. That's a fairly narrow set of things. So, in a way, there were clear mistakes down in the beginning. The mistakes were that economically politically feasible were, first of all, financial sanctions, and they were done. Those are the easy ones. I mean, we can talk about consequences of them, additional consequences and so on, but, in the moment, they were cheap to implement. And so secondary sanctions and enforcement, it's a little cheaper, but it's also fairly cheap economically to implement, but it took a year and a half to get to there, right? But the problem was that, not buying Russian oil was expensive to do economically and difficult to do politically. That was not been done. And so the combination of financial sanctions with export restrictions backfired, because that's exactly what created the inflow. Instead, the right policy would have been, and that's the first missed opportunity. The first months of war, the right policy, maximum financial pressure, because that's easy to do, plus the maximum restriction on buying resources and oil and gas and everything, and very targeted import sanctions on certain commodities. That's really crucial. You don't want to do the work. The second missed opportunity is, you can have oil prices of $85 a barrel. I mean, that's the main source of revenue. If the quantity of oil is as high as it ever been, and the prices are twice as high as just before the war, well, obviously, how effective is the abundance of resources here. So, the medium-term policy, the policy for the next 2 years was to do everything to bring those oil prices down in a similar way like LNG, natural gas prices. That didn't happen with the second reason. Even though U.S. oil production has increased, they increased very slowly in 1.5 years. If it was a high priority area, you increase oil production, you increase exports, you actually bring down the world oil prices. And the third opportunity expenditures is at the record low, right? We're in the midst of the largest war in Europe in the last 75 years, and the U.S. military expenditures are 2.7% of GDP. How come can that be optimal, right? And so Europe's military expenditure rising. Poland is going to 4%, Germany's for the first time at 2% of GDP. U.S. is coming down. It came down from 5% a couple of years ago to 2.7. It's a high priority thing. Obviously, that's another major missed economic opportunity to ramp up military production and military expenditure. And that's not been done. And so, given those three things, it's two missed opportunities. Everything else is peanuts, right? And you're just, not doing, price jump, 60 versus 55 versus 50 when oil prices are 85. It's not going to work. Right? There are too many incentives to go around the price gap. I mean, you shave off percentages of revenues here and there. You put some sand on the wheels, yes, but you don't change the big picture of things. Those three big things.
Christine?
Sure, I will say as well that the initial phase of the sanctions response is very much one of primary sanctions. And secondary sanctions, the U.S. has been the primary proponent of secondary sanctions prior to this time. And so for a sanctions regime to have been designed not based around primary sanctions, but to have encompassed significant amounts of secondary sanctions as well, would have been something really unheard of and extraordinary and perhaps not politically palatable to the EU, which has historically, in fact, strongly objected to the United States' use of secondary sanctions. And so we see the development of secondary sanctions and the implementation of secondary sanctions authorities over time as the scale of the evasion problem becomes known and is apparent. But had the secondary sanctions not been developed in response to that very visible problem, I wonder how much political support or support from those implementing the programs that secondary sanctions would have had at the outset.
Andrei?
Oh, yeah. Now, in my view, it was some opportunities in 2022 created not only by sanctions itself, but also by military situation. Yeah? Because actually Kremlin was not prepared to real war. And we can see during all this year in 2022 that it's quite clearly, yeah. And Kremlin tried to avoid this partial mobilization of September 2022, but they should do it, yeah. It was really some indicator of really serious internal problems. But it is exactly some kind of point of difference between me and Oleg, perhaps, I think. Because, yes, economic sanctions is the tool, and it is for pressure. But if there is no another side, and no some kind of offer, because again, in 2022, not only some artists left Russia, yeah, and in my view, it was quite a clear indicator of some split in Russian elite. Because, for instance, in 2014, we can see really this Crimea consensus after Crimea annexation, yeah? But it was totally not so in 2022. The same was at the level of society. But, again, absence of any offer oriented to this part of Russian elites and Russian society, which didn't support the war. In my view, it was really some kind of missed opportunity because, yes, now we can talk about it, think about it, and so on and so on, but time is important. And such people are now, on one hand, part of them left country. Another part, much bigger, is very strongly demotivated. And now it is much more difficult to provide incentives for these people.
So you're referring to the exit options. Sanctions
maybe some additional point. And again, it is about this conversation with this colleague from UK Foreign Office. He told not only about restricting financial opportunities for Kremlin to continue the war, but he told also about a changing foreign policy of Kremlin. And in my view, it is a big question what is necessary to change foreign policy of Kremlin or to provide incentives for regime change. And as I know, till now, for officials of State Department here, is really prohibited to talk about a regime change in any conversations with experts and so on. But if people on Western side till now believe that Putin can stop war and can provide some kind of credible commitment, not initiating new war, in my view, it's total illusion. And therefore, it's necessary to talk about regime change and about incentives to regime change. But if people on Western side in Europe and in US are not ready to talk about it, what we are discussing.
Excellent. Well, I have many more questions, but let's take some questions from the audience. Go ahead, Mikhail.
Yeah, Mikhail Troitsky, visiting professor here. So I just want to test this proposition by Professor Yakovlev about the possibility of kind of stimulating voice in Russia as opposed to exit option by offering a whole group some incentive that would apply then to that whole group should they somehow act to change the situation in Russia. Like what you do in this case, if you are the sanctioning party, is actually you are extending a promise that would help them to overcome this collective action problem. But how about this? And I'm not good at building economic models, but I'm just thinking of building a model which would kind of compare that approach with an alternative that would essentially be offering private incentives to individual members of those sanctioned elites, like you know which number to call, and and if there's something you can offer us, we are going to oblige, but just put your cards on the table, and it's kind of going to remain private, for example, right? But so maybe in that way you're going to get more by, and maybe Volos offered something, whereas, Mr. Kutseriev, he was in the news kind of offering his services and being turned down. He didn't have enough to offer, and then the sanctioning party has this ability to choose whom they want to reward, right? So maybe the sum total of what they get through kind of private, should say defections or actually cases of exit would be more than what they get, if they try to stimulate voice by some grand bargain. And that grand bargain is kind of difficult to pull off, and I can see why payoffs there can be lower, just for example, because of the difficulties to adjudicate the result. Who is going to be rewarded if regime change happens? Like, there are many fathers for a victory, right? So everyone will claim to have made a contribution. So I wonder if what is being done is this alternative for exit, which is available and has always been available, as opposed to just, sending that class a blanket promise to everyone, which may work, but may well not. I'm not sure how to write that equation. I might try and work on it.
Any thoughts on that?
I think we should take it.
That change it, that we can provide some incentives that will work. It wasn't great. That was a visibility of a regime change, and that was because, at the time, it's actually, the time is kind of similar now, but at the time, about 7 Russian soldiers a day or two on the front. I guess Ukrainian calculation at the time was that if you become the casualties that on your side, that would lead to regime change. But now there are, who knows, 200,000, dead and 400,000 wounded, and, regime change hasn't happened. There was a window during Prigozhin's coup. But this is the kind of thing that we're talking about, right? It's not like you can design an incentive scheme that somehow will solve that big coordination problem. And so Prigozhin coup, why did it fail? Well, not enough generals joined him during this march. Right. So this is really what we're talking about, right? It's not some type of monetary exchange that could facilitate it. Right? It's just at a different scale of magnitudes. And similarly, if the Russian budget was in deep deficit, if oil prices were much lower, if there was not enough money to do all this public spending, we would have been in a very different world. The heads of the regional governments, they would not be so eager to fulfill all their obligations to the center if the money was not flowing there, right? And so this is the alternative. But short of that, I don't think there is a magic wand that you can design a very smart policy and somehow it will give you the right outcome. Sort of those kind of things. That's my opinion.
So we have a question from Zoom from Parv Agarwal, who is a Fletcher alumnus. He asked, to what extent is there evidence of cryptocurrency being used for large-scale transactions by sanctioned entities, and given the most major crypto exchanges, including Binance, have excluded Russia, what third-party avenues or services have been most commonly used?
I'm not an expert on this at all, but the answer is yes, it's used very intensively, but beyond that, I'm not an expert at all.
No, actually, I'm also not expert, but in my view, if we are talking about large-scale transactions at international level, it will be difficult to organize necessary payments using only cryptocurrency and so on. So it can be used mostly for some kind of personal purposes. For instance, for moving money from Russia. Yes, it's true. But for payments, no, maybe for some kind of specific components for military industry, perhaps, yeah, but not at very large scale, in my view.
So it's not being used for sanctions evasion on a large scale.
No, again, in my view, it can be used in some specific situations, also to evade sanctions, but not at large scale.
Let me add to that just very quickly. So I think that's kind of an area where we don't have a very clear understanding. What's the role of the payment systems? Why payment systems are such a choke point? Why the reason why secondary financial sanctions were so effective is exactly that they operated on the choke point of the payment system. So when we talk about financial sanctions, it's really not borrowing and lending. Borrowing and lending is just not as essential in after 22 as it was maybe in 2014. But it's really just the carrying out the basic transactions, the basic trade transactions, even when you have the money, right? And somehow not having access to the Western payment system proves to be a choke point at the moment. So what we don't know whether that choke point will go away at the next iteration, and the next iteration might be in 6 months, a year, or during the next conflict. But at the moment, for example, having a rupee in your bank account in Russia is not a good substitute for having a yuan, and is a not good substitute for having a dollar, right? And so this is inside our economic model that doesn't quite make sense, right? Because we think if you have a spot piece of currency and somebody has access to the spot currency markets, that shouldn't be a big problem. But it proves to be very difficult to carry out these transactions across border. And the question is the durability of that effect. But yeah.
And to that point, perhaps to lengthen this effect as long as possible, this is definitely an area of enforcement for OFAC for one, and they've law enforcement actions against a number of currency exchanges and payment platforms and so forth, and that's an area where they really stress sanctions compliance, not just with respect to the Russian sanctions program, but with respect to sanctions compliance generally.
Yes, go ahead.
Firstly, I mean, this committee, I would like to understand the process of these people that are done sanctions. Regarding the banking concept, but where did the first very much of the bank? What is the reconsideration that to expect higher increases to companies so this whole product? Considering that Russia is one of the largest commodity exporters of all sorts. They come to and usually the question was mutually protected nations. Like, very only so the record but being a different so what do the Western aspect of these sanctions that both the Western economy and world than another commodity exporter, which is Russia?
Well, this is part of what Oleg was saying in terms of Europe not using those 8 years between 2014 and 2022 very effectively in terms of lowering its dependence on Russia. I mean, another interesting example is uranium, right, which the United States purchases, and even though it was recently sanctioned, the sanctions will not actually kick in for another 3 years, I think 2027. Any reactions to the question?
No, I can give you a insight into how this process works. In March 22, Europe realizes that they need to prepare for an embargo, and they start running all sorts of tests. To what extent? I mean, there is a long story before that. When Robert Habeck, who is an economic minister of Germany, he comes to power. It's 21. It's like September 21. He realizes the storage is empty. The gas storage is empty. Guess who owns gas storage in Germany? Well, it's Gazprom that owns gas storage in Germany. And Gazprom, in preparation for the war, started selling gas from the German gas storage. And they realized that not only they're not prepared for the war, actually Gazprom is sabotaging their any potential efforts to prepare for it because actually Gazprom owns, the storage facilities in Europe. How crazy is that, right? I mean, like, speaking of preparing for war, they use the next, months to try to sort of prepare it to the extent possible. And they realized that the likely scenario is that Gazprom actually unilaterally would stop selling oil to them, which happens later in like August or September 22. But it didn't happen before that. And surprisingly, Europe actually was quite, this is the market where the adjustment did happen. The US LNG came to Europe very quickly and replaced Russian gas, well, LNG from other markets as well. But like by, end of April, Robert Habeck has a speech in which he says, well, Germany is actually prepared now for Russia unilaterally cutting off the gas supply. And for Germany, gas was more important than oil. Oil is a commodity you can buy in world markets. And they're like, we're actually prepared if needed to do the embargo. And then Janet Yellen gives a speech saying that you should not rush with that. And she actually visited Germany at the time, that's around May 22, where she says, well, our counterfactual scenarios show that if you do an embargo on Russian oil, maybe oil prices go to $200 a barrel instead of current 120. And that was their main motivation, right? And so now, I mean, I think it's important to kind of understand how the game theory of this works. The game theory of this works like if something that was not supposed to happen happens, and the war in Ukraine was not supposed to happen, right? Then you really have to go to the biggest punishment possible. If you don't, you accept that this is an equilibrium outcome. It's the kind of thing that will be happening in equilibrium. But if it's the kind of thing that will be happening in equilibrium, that's very costly because these things will keep happening. It's not just 2022 when it's going to happen. It's going to happen over and again because this is because the Western sanction response was not strong enough, not devastating enough. So it kind of allows these things to happen. So the game theory of this is like if you want to commit to this thing staying off equilibrium, something that's not supposed to happen, you have to go with the full sanctions. If you don't go with this, then it becomes a cost-benefit analysis. Once it becomes a cost-benefit analysis, you accept that these things will keep happening. And obviously, it's much, much costlier if these things keep happening. So the calculations are actually kind of different here. It's not just this time, what's the cost and the benefit of sanctions. It's like, what is the role of today to prevent these things happening in the future? And clearly, we're shifted to the world where these things are part of our equilibrium life. And now you're going to have to do cost-benefit analysis of the sort where you're like, well, if you do sanctions, maybe oil prices go to $200 a barrel, right? And so I think they focus too much on this counterfactuals and too little on thinking about what is sort of the incentive compatibility going forward, right? And that's why I said that they did what was economically cheap and politically feasible to do, right? As opposed to what maybe would be suitable. I mean, it's a long conversation. I have a lot more to say on this.
Other reactions?
And I think it's observable in the structure of the price cap itself, right? It's not designed to inflict maximum harm, right? It's designed to balance the competing objectives. As you say, it's I think the decision that the trade-off is inherent in the legal design.
Yes.
I'd like to follow up on Eric's question. What could have done, what could have been better? But a little bit more radical. Is it possible to impose sanctions on Russia to use Russian rights soil? So I think it was a guy who in his discussions said, right, for sanctions to bear fruit, it has to be like soil. So the question, and also in the end of his book, he gives this list of do's and don'ts, and one of the these are like you can only do it to small nations, you can only do it to your allies, it only applies to leverage. And don'ts were not like any garden economies or economies. So are we talking about are economic sanctions to be efficient in this world in the big powers at all? I don't know what I'm talking about this, but I'm just wondering what are we doing about this? And the second question, secondary sanctions, I'm doing research in tech. So now seeing these tech sanctions, this conversation that started on the sovereign internet, if we get cut off from the whole world, is prepared. So that makes a lot of countries in the world, looking at different developing economies that are at the intersection of choosing which way to go with infrastructure. It makes it more appealing. It makes Western tech companies less appealing and makes other partners, including China, it's not a great partner, but it's still another option. It kind of like shifts balances in different parts of the world. Like, third countries will choose other way. But, you know, in this case, well, it's kind of a big example.
I will say, I think it's an interesting question to take the last part of your question first, about the weaponization of digital services, or more generally speaking, higher tech items. I think it's akin to the discussion of sanctions and financial sanctions, right? In that the larger question is, to the extent that the United States or others weaponize, whether it be the dollar, or exactly, weaponize independence.
To avoid that still detrimental and like
Yeah, I think it raises the question: at what point is there a detachment rather than continued usefulness of the tool, right? And I think that's the question with respect to sanctions. That's the question with respect to export controls on higher tech items, right? It's a valuable tool, but pushed too far, the concern is that there's a detachment and a turn to alternative sources, whether that be currency or tech tools or what have you. And so it is an interesting question. I don't necessarily have an answer, but I think you put your finger there on an overarching question that, right, that really frames these issues.
I mean, there's a lot to discuss here, but I mean, just when you think about it, how can, like, are you saying that no sanctions at all is optimal? That's the question. That's the counterfactual, or maybe subsidy is better. Maybe we should subsidize some. It's just like, how do you think that you're taking some optimality condition and it will pop out that like you have this massive externality, non-economic externality, and it's good not to do anything at all. It's just hard to imagine writing down a model where that would be the outcome, that like, or, you know, but like Y0 is a special point. Why not go into the subsidy then or something like that, right? I mean, like, then you have to take into account all the subtleties. Yes, we live in a big world where substitution is possible. So you have to build coalitions. If you cannot build coalitions, you need to use secondary sanctions and coerce the countries outside of coalitions to do what they want. All of this has costs. You have to like factor it into account in the design and come up with an optimal sanctions mix given that. You need to take into account the reputational things, right? Like that you have this payment system, which is your asset. And of course, if you use it, you know, next time, you're not going to have that as a unique asset because, you know, China will build the thing. It's not like China doesn't know that you have that asset and is not trying to build a parallel thing. So it's not like by using it now, you're somehow, you know, thinking that China is not trying to build a parallel payment system, right? I mean, of course, it's all happening. I mean, we're shifting to a fragmented world. Fragmented world is bad for everyone who participates in it. Free trade, of course, is better, but free trade has to come at some common understandings of what are the rules of the game. When rules are broken, then you start like thinking, right? Like, how do you respond to the rules being violated? And like no response is hard to imagine that's part that's part of an optimal policy. There was more things to discuss here, but I think you really need to have this framework of like, of course, like if US and China could do a grand bargain right now, and like, let's redesign the world institutions, right? The institutions that we designed back in 1945, 46 after the Second World War are no longer good, right? Like, you know, United Nations doesn't work, WTO doesn't work. Let's sit together and redesign. Let's do this grand bargain between US and China so that US and China are two players that would actively participate in sort of like making these institutions work together, right? And if somebody violates, and the whole point of these institutions, these are rule-based institutions. So if somebody violates the rules, it comes with consequences. And who needs to enforce the rules? Well, the two big countries that are out there. Of course, if, you know, it's hard to imagine right now that US and China will sit together and redesign that institutional system. So we shift into a fragmented world where US is designing a set of rules and institutions and China is designing a set of rules and institutions. It's a very suboptimal world, but that's clearly where we're going. But still, it has to be a rules-based world within each fragmented piece, right? And violation of rules need to be enforced by somebody. And it can, like, think about WTO. What holds WTO together? Well, the fact that there is US, and US would punish anybody who deviates. But for this, US needs to stick to the rules. Once US stops sticking to the rules of WTO, the whole thing falls apart. And like, we live in a period where WTO no longer works, right? Because US chose, in 2016 not to stick to the rules of WTO, right? And I mean, yeah.
So speaking of the rules of the WTO and grand bargains, of course, we have in the United States the incoming second Trump administration, and Trump has famously vowed to seat Putin and Zelensky at the negotiating table and come to a resolution of the war. And I wonder how sanctions might play a role in terms of either carrots or sticks. What sanctions would Putin most be interested in lifting, and what are some of the areas in which the United States could escalate sanctions if it needed to?
Yeah, I guess perhaps Andrei knows the best. What
No, I'm not sure. I can say something about Russian business, but not about Putin. And I suppose that preferences of Putin can be quite different from preferences of business. Yeah. So, in my view, for Putin, some kind of non-economic sanctions, like this order to arrest him by this International Criminal Court, yeah, it can be much more important comparing to all economic sanctions. Yeah, but
no, but I think the same framework applies here. Whether you are negotiating or not, you want maximum pressure. Maximum pressure, what gives the results? I mean, there is the economic cost of Putin pressure. So you have, once we are in this world where we're really doing the cost-benefit analysis, you're doing that cost-benefit analysis. Once you put the maximum pressure, that's the same thing that improves your bargaining position at the negotiations. But you do it before the negotiations start, because that, plays best before, during the war and before and once negotiations start, you are at the best bargaining position. If before that you could impose maximum pressure, whether militarily, for example, the long-range missile strikes, they create a bargaining position. Same thing with economic sanctions, right? Like oil embargo or gas embargo or whatever. This creates the bargaining position, and this is something that's used, right? And I mean, it's kind of interesting to think about counterfactuals, right? There was this potential peace negotiations in, when was it? April, May, June 22 in Turkey, right? If those negotiations were carried out under a full energy embargo and no oil revenues, the outcome of those negotiations could have been very different. Right? I mean, Ukraine lost much bigger part of its territory at that moment, and it regained the territory later on that year. But if economically there was a lot more pressure on Russia, the outcome of these peace talks would have been very, very different, right? I mean, This is the counterfactual we would not know. But again, during any negotiation, you have to have maximum economic pressure and military pressure.
Well, I mean, ultimately, it's a question about how much leverage the sanctions give the United States at the negotiating table. Andrei, you wanted to
some kind of additional dimension. In my view, it's necessary to talk not only about the spectrum of sanctions which can be discussed and so on, but also about who will be counterpart. If it will be Putin, it is one story. And again, it is, in my view, a very big question about any credible commitment on the side of Putin now. Yeah? If it will be some another person or group of persons and so on, it can be a totally different story. And again, coming back, for instance, to this example provided by Oleg with Prigozhin's coup. A key problem was that Prigozhin didn't plan to change regime. he simply would remove Shoigu and Gerasimov. No more. It was no real coup in real terms. And again, if even some generals would support him, it will not let, at these conditions of June 2023, to regime change. It's a problem. And again, my point is that we can discuss all possible designs of negotiations with Putin. In my view, with a result close to zero.
Yes. Hello, my name is Ryland Steady here at Fletcher, and I'm going to ask about a case study, but I'll leave the questions a bit more broad. So Rosatom is the state corporation for atomic energy, but they don't just work in Russia. They've got problems in Turkey, Hungary, Egypt, India. Potentially, they're on the bid list for the new power plant if it ever gets built in Kazakhstan. So I'm wondering, how do Western powers balance the sanctioned entities that are generating revenue for Russia's war machine that are, Rosatom had a key role in planning part of the invasion and how they would utilize the nuclear plant in Zaporizhia. So it's Zaporizhia, right? Or the nuclear plant. So how do Western powers balance exacerbating global energy vulnerabilities by taking away some company that plays an integral role in nuclear energy around the world, while also staying consistent with the stated goal of keeping the Russian economy from operating with international partners and keeping companies that played a role in the war from making the war effort more effective.
Well, that's a bit of $1 million question now, isn't it? Right? I think it's the same, the same sort of calculus that you see with respect to aluminum and titanium, right? And whether it be energy or metals, right? It's the essential question of the sanctioning nations of how to balance the design of sanctions and the desire to inflict harm with the recognition that this will cause economic pain on those in the sanctioning nations, right? And so I think that that's one prime example of that, right? And that's why perhaps financial sanctions are and were the first among those, the first implemented, right? Because of the lesser probability of harm to those in the sanctioning nations, whereas things like energy and metals, right? It's harder. It's a much harder choice. As time goes on, for example, with respect to metals and so forth, you see a desire to ratchet up sanctions by reaching those areas which were left out of initial rounds. And so you see a gradual increase over time, but again, it's a desire not to have the effects reach those in the sanctioning countries.
Yes.
So, seems like we're dancing around a question. Would Putin just allow Ukraine to be driven into a ditch no matter what? Or like you presented all the macroeconomic statistics and trade statistics. Does Putin really care about that? It's not like he's going to get rid of that Olympics. But what would he actually take? If he was insulating himself from the coup, what would it actually take to have him reverse his policy, especially now that
this war is very expensive. It's $150 billion a year. That's a lot of money. So in particular, he needs to recruit 30,000 soldiers a month. And the price of the soldier is going up.
40,000.
Yeah, so he's paying about 10 times the going market rate. If the market rate is 100 rubles a month in certain regions, he's paying $100 a month. He's paying $1,000 a month per soldier. This is an expensive war. And so it's not like you can carry it out without the resources, right? He needs to buy the drones, he needs to produce the drones, he needs to, you have to keep in mind the interest rate in Russia is 21%. That is a huge strain on the whole economy. So you can keep doing it, but it's not like resources are limitless, right? And so, of course, at $80 a barrel, you can do a lot of stuff. You can do significantly less at 60. Would you stop? Probably not. But it's a very different situation. If you keep shaving off of those revenues, it's a qualitatively different situation. And he yet needs to, he needs to recruit the soldiers, but he also needs to deliver some of his other promises to the population. For example, why the interest rate is 21%? Why wouldn't they let it go? I mean, it's a counterfactual scenario. I mean, they can't just give up on the interest rate. I mean, it's a pressure point on the economy, that interest rate. But if they give that up, people will go to the banks and take out their savings and start spending them. So the only reason they're not spending them is because of a 21% interest rate. If they start spending it, I mean, there are no goods in the economy to satisfy that. And so, I mean, it's a balancing act. This balancing act is easy for him when oil prices are $80 a barrel. It becomes harder when they're 70. They become increasingly harder when they're 60. But yeah, we don't have a sign of an imminent crisis right now, given the current macroeconomic situation. But it's not to say that it's a robust and stable situation that can last for years as well.
What do you think are the signs that we should look for in the next year, 2 years, 3 years? I mean, you mentioned issues like the labor market dislocations, but we don't see anything yet resembling an economic crisis. So, at what point might the situation change?
I have an article on the topic about things that you might look at, which we don't see yet, meaning that there is a resource. So, inflation is only 12% or, 10, 12, 11. We'll see two-digit inflation, higher two-digit inflation. That would be one sign. We'll see conversion of, savings potentially. So the government would need to get the resources. The population has the savings. The government would need to tap into that in different ways. We're going to see changes in taxation. We're going to see much more devalued ruble. So ruble right now is 100. I think yesterday it crossed 100 again. And one thing to keep in mind, the Russian economy was designed to break even at $45 a barrel. We are at, as of today, we're at 73, something like that. But it was designed before the war to break even at 45, with the ruble exchange rate of something like 65 rubles a dollar. So now we are at $80 a barrel and 100 rubles a dollar. So this exchange rate is one of the things that allows to adjust, because if oil prices come down, you can devalue the ruble, and that's a source of flexibility for the economy. So if oil prices go to 60, we'll see ruble at whatever it would be, 140, 150. And there is a lot, to go back to Michael's question, there is a lot of flexibility there. It's not like it's a cracking point right now, but it's also not endless flexibility, right?
So we have just a few minutes left. Let's collect the last two questions, please.
In terms of enforcement on sanctions, do you think that it's very effective, or there are certain ways that enforcement can be improved? And there are certain issues in enforcement that which can be domestic issues in the US, the U.S. acts immigration policy, use sanctions, and the election commission use sanctions as a tool to influence U.S. administration with their policy and say we can do damage to pro-Russian rules. And there is a explore Russian Russia to coordinate against China or any other tools. Can we use this to influence Trump and his administration?
Andrei, you want to start? We'll have concluding thoughts.
Okay. No, in my view, Russia has really very few opportunity to provide any impact on US now in economic terms. So answering your question. So regarding your question, the specificity of situation with sanctions against Russia is that Russia is really quite big country. And there is a huge number of players from, first of all, global south, but not only. Yeah? which would like to extract some kind of profit from the deals with Russia. Yeah, and in terms of monitoring, it's possible to monitor large companies, middle-sized companies, but it's really very difficult to monitor all small companies. And again, it can be costly for Russian counterparts to use all these small sham firms and so on and so on, but it's possible. And it works.
With respect to enforcement, I think that the biggest concerns are the transshipment of export-controlled items through third-party nations and the enforcement of the price cap. Right, and so I think that that's where we've seen enforcement efforts directed, including through additional sanctions and sanctions, including through secondary sanctions, and I think that. Right, I don't know how to answer the question of whether or not that's been effective, because no, it hasn't been effective, certainly in stopping those activities. I think that it's an ongoing effort, and it's enforcement is a way to having moved past the implementation stage, right, to increase the effectiveness of the sanctions designations already in place. And so I think it's the United States and other governments are directing their energies in that area. They're seeing some successes. Certainly there have been evasion activities uncovered, but I do think that there are certainly in the data indicate that there are some widespread evasion activities, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all enforcement has been for nothing and the sanctions should be abandoned, right? It's they could. Certainly enforcement activities could be furthered in that area. I wouldn't call them ineffective.
Christine made a very important point that Europe actually was quite reluctant to support secondary sanctions because they really didn't like it. It was in the context of Iran, I guess, when a lot of European companies were under secondary sanctions and they felt it's very unfair. But what we learned over the last 2.5 years is extremely hard to enforce real sector sanctions. So because this oil intermediaries popped up in different parts of the world, right? Like there were these intermediaries that were shown, like real sector intermediaries selling Russian oil would pop up in different countries. Russia will buy the shadow fleet. The US would have to go after individual ships that are violating sanctions. You have to identify them. Super costly. And what was learned is that the financial sanctions provide you the best way for enforcement because it pushes due diligence onto the banks. It's much harder to create a one-day bank. It's much easier to create a one-day oil trader, it turns out, right? And so, this has kind of been known since the war on terror that, using the financial sanctions is really effective because you push all the due diligence onto the banks. What's been learned now, this is quite effective even with the banks that are in China, right? That's the lesson of the last couple of years, that Chinese bank. And so here's the big question. Is it because China is just very careful right now and the banks are careful, but eventually they will be fragmented enough? And this is going back to the question that we discussed before, that maybe 2 years we'll find ourselves in a fragmented world where Chinese banks no longer care about it, or maybe not, right? But as of today, financial sanctions happen to be the most effective for enforcement, exactly because the financial institutions in other parts of the world, they're very careful and they actually do quite a lot of due diligence. They're not willing to, play with fire for now. How long it lasts, we actually don't know.
Great. Well, thank you to our esteemed panel for their insights, and thank you to our audience for your astute questions. And please join me in a round of applause.